Australian house prices have shown remarkable resiliency in the face of 13 interest rate hikes. In fact, they've regained all the ground they've lost and are now nationally sitting at all-time highs. However, with the recent announcement of a government crackdown on record immigration levels combined with a weakening economy, the good times may well and truly be over for the Australian housing market. So as we head into 2024, house prices seem to be headed for another decline, and there are a number of storm clouds forming which could actually result in a housing crash. I'm Biko Konstantinos, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Here's a riddle for you. What's greater than God, worse than the devil, and stronger than the Australian housing market? You guessed it, absolutely nothing. In fact, the Australian housing market is so strong, even if half the population were wiped out, people would keep bidding house prices higher just so they could get their 10th or 20th investment property, even if no one was living in it, because Australian house prices always go up, baby. And you know what else goes up? My subscriber numbers when you subscribe. So give it a go and make sure you like this video as well. 2024 could bring some big changes, so you really want some independent analysis and commentary to keep you informed. As you can see via this graph, Australian house prices have once again reached all-time high levels. As I've discussed in the past, COVID policies sent house prices through the roof, creating a speculative bubble during 2021. I think we can all remember the crazy house price gains fueled by a massive fear of missing out, desperation in the market. So after the craziest house price boom we've ever seen, the central bank started raising interest rates, and shortly after, house prices actually started declining quite significantly in Australia. Now, the very strange thing is that once interest rates got actually quite high, house prices once again started rising. Now, this seems a bit counterintuitive because you wouldn't expect house prices to start rising strongly unless you saw interest rates actually start falling. But not in Australia, where the housing market is harder to kill than John Bloody Wick. So we saw crazy demand and speculation in 2021. Things eased off a bit, but then once again, crazy demand and desperation returned to the Australian housing market. And one huge contributing factor to this was record levels of immigration. You see, the government opened the immigration floodgates and sent net migration levels through the roof to crazy levels for a small populated country like Australia. So we saw this influx of net migration at the same time that the building industry was collapsing. So we had increased demand for housing, but less housing actually being built. So this just created another perfectly timed scenario to send house prices surging again, so that politicians' massive property portfolios can rise another few million bucks. Did I say that? But seemingly because everyone started talking about it and Albo's approval rating started dropping like a lead balloon, the government has backflipped on migration, saying they're going to clamp down on immigration rorts and look to halve net migration levels in the next financial year. So this is a significant policy change that will remove some of that additional demand for housing, because as the population increases by lower amounts, there should be less overall demand for housing, and when you have less demand, prices don't grow as quickly, or they can start to decline. So this immigration factor that's massively supported the housing market is about to end, and with it, crazy out of this world capital gains. So the immigration factor is going to reduce, but that by itself is not enough to tank house prices. So let's now go through all the factors that combined could send Australian house prices significantly lower, or even potentially lead to a crash. First, we have the effects of much higher interest rates. At the current cash rate of 4.3%, most of the major banks are now offering variable mortgage rates around 6.5%. Now, even though 6 or 7% mortgage rates are pretty close to the historical Australian average, the actual impact today is much higher because Australia has a ridiculous amount of debt for property. Now, with interest rates, the impact normally has a delayed effect. When COVID hit, mortgage holders hit the jackpot because interest rates were kept at zero for so long. This allowed increased payments of mortgages, increased rates of saving, and so on. So once interest rates started to rise, they didn't affect people straight away because they had had it so easy because of COVID policies. But after 13 interest rates, and the longer we go on when rates stay relatively high, the impact on people's financial budgets starts to have a much larger effect. So basically anyone with a reasonably sized mortgage is definitely starting to feel the pain of paying such large mortgage payments when you compare it to their overall income. Now this affects the economy because that impacted sector of the community is unable to spend as much as they normally could. But it also affects housing because some property owners, especially investors, might now be in over their head that they're required to sell one or more properties. But it also means that some home buyers and investors will now not have enough income to buy another property, and that could reduce overall demand for property. Another factor relating to interest rates is the huge reduction in borrowing capacity. Since the interest rate lows to where they sit today, borrowing capacity has been reduced by around 30%. So plain and simply, someone who could borrow $1 million when interest rates were at their lowest can now only borrow $700,000 from the bank. This means that every home buyer has less potential homes that they're able to bid on. It also means that many buyers will just not be able to reach the levels that sellers are asking for. So unless people are bidding over the top, then sellers might have to reduce the price of their properties to meet what buyers are able to afford. And when this happens on a larger scale, overall house prices tend to fall. Another thing that's massively impacting people's ability to buy homes is the crazy cost of living increases we've seen over the last few years since COVID. Inflation has been at very high levels, but the real cost of living increases has been much higher than that. If you check out this graph of disposable income, which has been adjusted due to inflation, you can see large increases decade after decade, but over the last decade, there's actually been a drop in disposable income. Now, disposable income is the amount of money that you have to spend after taxes have been taken out, but when inflation or costs of goods and services grow faster than your actual income rises, the overall value of your income reduces because everything now costs so much more. So millions of Australians have actually gone backwards financially. It means that many people haven't been able to save as much money as they previously were able to, and this means that they wouldn't be able to offer as much for a property, and sadly, many people just can't save enough deposit to be able to buy any property at all. So we've got the triple whammy of higher mortgage rates, drastically reduced borrowing capacity, and a sharp increase in cost of living expenses, which leads to significantly lower disposable income. Now, the contrasts in this country are actually bewildering. On the one hand, we've got record property prices, making millions of property owners extremely rich, especially those with large property portfolios. But on the other hand, we've got a growing housing crisis where millions of renters are struggling to find affordable rentals, and very sadly, across Australia, we're seeing more and more people being forced to live in tents in a park. If you look at some of these images, tent communities are on the rise, and it's not people that don't want to work. Many of these people have full-time jobs, but either just can't find a rental or can't afford the crazy rental prices. So what does this mean for the housing market? Well, basically, the government has a growing housing crisis that, if it continues to ignore, could easily turn into a humanitarian crisis. In Canada, there's been a huge rise in homelessness, and sadly, Australia is heading in the same direction. So when you have a housing affordability crisis, there'll be more pressure put on the government to help ease the crisis and make housing more affordable. Many attribute Prime Minister Albanese's terrible approval rating due to his inaction on the housing and cost of living crisis. And because of this, it looks like they're starting to take notice. First, we saw the announcement of the immigration clampdown, and then we saw the announcement of tripling taxes for foreigners who buy existing houses in Australia, and a doubling of fees for foreign buyers who leave properties vacant. So there was a clampdown on immigration, which add extra demand for property, and then we saw a bit of a clampdown on foreign buyers, and we know they add extra demand for property in Australia. Now, these changes won't have a huge impact, but they are a clear indication that the government knows it has to take action on housing affordability. And with images of tent communities growing every day, they'll face more pressure in 2024 to take additional action to improve housing affordability for Australians. Now, I've gone through a number of factors which all combined should see downward pressure on house prices throughout 2024. But could house prices actually crash in 2024 and see house price declines of 20% or more? Well, in my opinion, the biggest factor that could cause a crash would be a sharp increase in unemployment. You see, our economy has been very weak, but if it wasn't for the recent record levels of immigration, would actually now be smack bang in the middle of a decent recession. There's only one real way that unemployment levels can go, and that's up. But how sharply unemployment levels rise will determine the amount of downward pressure put onto house prices. So hold on to your hats, because 2024 is just around the corner and house prices look poised to decline. And just maybe, the unkillable Australian housing market might get a beat down. I'm Biko Konstantinos.